Hello, everyone. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. You should be able to see the QR code on the screen. So if you do have a phone or another device handy, feel free to scan that QR code to be able to watch our most recent farmer testimonial videos. We'll get started shortly at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Okay, so it's now 1 p.m. So to be mindful of everyone's time, we will get started. So welcome everyone. My name is Vicky Brisson. I'm the National Knowledge Mobilization Manager at Lactanet, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Bienvenue tout le monde. Je m'appelle Vicky Brisson. Je suis la
Welcome everyone,
gestionnaire
I'm Vicky
nationale
Brisson.
de la
I'm
mobilisation
National
des connaissances chez
Manager
Lactanet.
for
Et je serai votre
Knowledge at
hôte ce
Lactanet, and I'll
webinaire.
be your host for this webinar.
Before we start, please note that this webinar features participants in both official languages. Please follow the instructions on the screen to make sure that you're set up to listen exclusively in your preferred language. To hear the audio in the language of your choice, at the bottom of your screen, you should see several webinar controls. You'll want to click Interpretation on the right-hand side. If you can't see it, you may have to click on More and then Interpretation. Click the language that you would like to hear. You can also just choose to stay on the main line if you are bilingual. To hear the interpreted language only, you will want to click Mute Original Audio. Donc, je vais aussi le partager en français.
I'll also share this in French. Before we start, please note that this webinar, we have participants in both official languages, so thank you for following these instructions that you see on your screen to make sure that you listen only in the language of your choice. To listen to the audio in the language of your choice, as you can see on the screen, click on Interpretation at the bottom of your screen to the right. If you don't see it, click on More and then click on Interpretation. Click on the language of your choice, and to hear only the interpreters, click on Mute Original Audio.
In English, if you're still having trouble setting up simultaneous translation, please send messages to my team members, Juno or Danik. Send them a message in the chat function so that they can assist you. Si vous rencontrez toujours des difficultés,
if you're still having some issues to obtain simultaneous interpretation, please send to Mo or Danik, send them a message in the chat so they can help you in the chat.
We also have two screens today that are being shared, one in French and one in English. Please view the instructions on the screen to make sure that you're set up to view the correct presentation for the language of your choice. Thanks for joining us today for this Canadian Dairy Hub webinar so that we can learn, act, and improve together for the future of our industry. On a également deux écrans partagés.
We also have a split screen that's being shared, one in French, one in English. So look at these instructions on the screen to make sure that you follow the right presentation in the language of your choice. So thank you for being with us today for this webinar, with this a journey through the dry period so we can learn together.
So now that you should all be set up to listen, I have some other housekeeping items to share with you. In today's webinar, only our panelists and myself will have their cameras and microphones turned on. But we'd love to hear from you during this webinar. Please use the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom menu to exchange with other participants and ask questions throughout the webinar. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be shared with you in the coming days. However, we do encourage you to stay for the whole webinar so that you can ask all of your questions directly to our panelists. En français.
And now in French, by talking about our guests,
on va les présenter dans les prochaines minutes.
The guests will be introduced in a few moments, but first of all, I'd like to go over what is coming up in the next hour. Our three panelists, first of all, will have the chance to introduce themselves. Trevor DeVries, a researcher at the Guelph University, Audrey Villeneuve from 3V Farm in Ontario, and Tyler Howard from Isle Vale Osteens in P.E.I. Our two producers will talk about challenges and successes linked to issues on their farm. And Chercheur DeVries afterwards will talk also about the challenges that he's faced over this period and also propose some possible solutions based on the best practices recommended and results from studies. Finally, we'll take the time to answer your questions. Don't hesitate to write those questions in the chat throughout the webinar. If we were together in person, we would introduce each other while having a coffee. Seeing I can't see all participants at today's webinar, I invite you to share with us in the chat some information about you, who you are, your name, your role in our industry, and where you are right now today. So we're pleased to welcome you here today. So today we're meeting within this group funded by the Canadian Dairy Producers, managed by Lactanet. This project wants to provide information and practical solutions and scientific solution to you, our dairy producers, as well as to advise you when it comes to best practices, when it comes to health and wellness and reproduction of herds and for sustainability.
I now invite our panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Dr. Trevor DeVries.
Well, hello. Yeah, as Vicky mentioned, my name is Trevor DeVries. I'm a professor with the University of Guelph, and in that role primarily work in research, teaching, and also extension of our research activities. The focus of my research program is really focused on dairy cattle management, nutrition, behavior, welfare, looking at opportunities to not only improve the health, production, and welfare of dairy cows, but then also do so in a manner that's also going to promote success for dairy farmers as well. And yeah, really looking forward to being part of this webinar today and the discussions that we're going to have.
Thank you so much, Trevor. I'm now going to ask Trevor to turn on his camera, unmute himself, and share a few words about himself and who he is.
Hi, my name's Tyler Howard. I milk with my family, my brother and my mom in Springfield, Prince Edward Island. We took over the farm in 2002. At the time, we were milking about 40 kgs. Today, we milk over 280 cows. We focus on cow health and growing the farm for the next generation. We have focused on the dry cows from numerous programs now to get to the one we have today. We have lots of advisors that help us, and looking forward to sharing our farm today.
Thanks so much, Tyler, for joining us from across from Prince Edward Island. Maintenant, en français,
and now in French, I would ask Audrey Villeneuve to turn on her camera so she can introduce herself.
Bonjour.
Well, hello, Audrey Villeneuve from the 3V farm in Ontario, from Saint-Eugène. We started in 99 in Ontario. We had 200 dairy cows, around 230 kilograms of quota. And in fact, we were working like this since 99. And we just moved to robotics recently. And right now we have 223 kilograms of quota.
Now,
I'm owner with my brother Carl Villeneuve and my mom. We are owners of this business. I manage the dairy herd since I'm 21 years of age. And well, there you have it. 3 co-owners right now at our farm. So thank you very much, Audrey. So we'll continue in French a little bit. So before we listen to Tyler and Audrey so they can explain how they manage their dry cows, I would ask Yannick to start the first question that we have for you. So I invite you to answer to these questions quickly. So this will give us a better idea of what interests you when it comes to that very important period for your herd. So we have three questions, and we'll ask you to fill it out. First of all, what is the biggest dry period challenge? Also, for you, how would you define, how do you manage dry cows? And also, how do you learn? What are the best practices when it comes to managing dry cows? We're asking you these questions because it's important for us to know who you want to hear from which topic so that we can continue to include all of these people and these questions in the next steps, and also that you can have access to the information and the tools you need where you get those tools. So it's important for us to know what are your biggest challenge when it comes to that period, to make sure that Trevor has pertinent questions and information when it comes to our participants, so he can take that in consideration when he shares some recommendation with you. And our producers also will share with you some challenges they've had and some solutions and some ideas that may inspire you through this information. So I see that we have a few participants already answered that survey. I'll give you a bit more time. So once again, when you answer the question, we invite you to, well, answer the question. Yes, I see that we have some people that have yet to answer all questions. So yes, someone is want to speak.
Ending the polls, and that stops everyone from answering it. So I just keep relaunching it.
Yeah, so we'll let the polls run so that everyone can answer. We will let the poll run just for the next few minutes as we start the conversation, just to make sure that everyone has a chance to answer those. And then as more answers come in, then we'll close it. If you are a guest, you can probably just move it to the side if that works for you. Are you able to move it to the side so that it's not in your way?
So I'm just going to relaunch it again. If no one could press end poll, that would be great. Thank you.
So I'm just leaving a few. Okay, we'll keep going, and we'll try again on our second poll. So to get started, I'm going to ask a few questions to Tyler. So we're starting our conversation of the day with you, Tyler. I just see that your camera went off. So that might be a little technical glitch. I just want to make sure that it's back on so that we can have a great conversation with you. Tyler, can you hear me and see me?
Nope, I can't hear you.
So in that case, Tyler, we're just gonna switch. We're gonna give you time to adjust to that technical challenge. We're just gonna mute you for now. And Audrey, we're gonna start off with you. Donc, on va commencer en français. Audrey, merci d'être flexible et d'être prête à répondre à mes questions.
So thank you, Audrey, to be flexible and be ready to answer your question. If you could turn on your camera, it'd be great. We could start the discussion with you today while we get Tyler back. So, Audrey, could you explain to us? Okay, let's put Tyler on mute for now. All right. So, Audrey, can you explain how you manage your dry cows, generally speaking? Well, right now, with dry cows, we have two groups. Once we have a dry cow, it's in a dry group. It's a fire off group, as we call it. And then 3 weeks before, we put them in preparation stalls. That's a second group. So we have two rations for dry cows. The first ration is for far off, and another ration which is for close-up. In fact, right now, our dry cows, they stay, well, as you can see on the screen, on tie right now. And 3 weeks before, when they're ready to be transferred, we put them on bed pack. And in summer, we use peat moss. For us, it works well. Peat moss, you know, yeah, peat moss.
Puis, dans le fond, c'est pas mal la façon dont on gère les vaches taries dans
That's
les...
how we manage dry cow on our farm, all right, in various groups. Well, that's a new system for you, huh? I think you've made a lot of changes over the last few years. You made some renovations. What's the challenge that you faced when you started managing dry cows?
Dans le fond, on a eu plusieurs au courant des
We've had
années.
several challenges over the years. In fact, first of all, over 10 years ago, we have one group of dry cows. They were dry and they stayed there. They were in a group. After that, we separate them as we do now, and we have the far off and close up. Challenges which we faced. The major challenge when you have one group, one group of dry cows, is to have a well-balanced ration, allowing you to have a good start for milk. Often it's a bit more expensive, I'd say, because your cow in preparation for calving, which will be calving, has to be nourished with, a milk startup. And then, if you feed that cow like us, we do this for the 3 weeks before calving, but before that period, we still manage to have a ration that costs us, well, it's not too costly because we don't have to have a ration that is calving preparation throughout that dry period. It's happened to us that to have one group, and I say the main reason that we change is so that we could save some money. Afterwards, also, we had a cold dome, an outside one, a bit like in the pictures that you can see. It's something that we built ourselves. This is a dome that was designed for equipment, and we renovated it, and we changed it a bit. And right now, you can see it was changed a bit, but this is where the cows were before. So in fact, the main problems that we had with that building were that the animal density was an issue. It was always overcrowded. There were too many animals in that building, maybe in calving or dry cows. It was always very tight. And the number of animals that were in there was pretty tight, pretty crowded. And what was a major issue in the wintertime, there wasn't enough if we didn't watch them closely, we would lose some calves because of the cold. Otherwise, we had less surveillance than we do now, so there was more issues linked to detecting sick animals, or in general, when a cow was calving, we weren't watching them as closely, so this brought about more challenges. And now, today, as you saw in the first pictures at the screen, inside, with the robot. So now, that's our facility. that we use right now. Great. And right, you've made some changes and you put in place a dry program that's rigorous and you still use it. Can you tell us when do you move to this program? You know, what brought you to proceed that way with dry cow housing? And before you answer, I see there's a question in the chat just to make sure that everyone has access to translation.
So if you are Anglophone, you should be able to click on the three little dots and interpretation to hear Audrey's answers directly in English. Donc, merci Audrey. Juste une petite
So
pause
thank you, Audrey. That was just a quick pause to make sure that people can hear what you have to share. So now, right? So how do you proceed this way for dry cows? Well,
présentement,
right now,
on tarie les vaches les premières lactations à 60
after
jours.
at 60 days for
Sinon,
lactation, we move on to
tout
dry
ce qui
cows.
est
Otherwise,
deuxième veau et plus, on
second
tarie
calf
à
and everything else,
45 jours.
we do it at 45
La
days with
raison
dry
pourquoi,
cows. The reason
je dirais
why,
qu'on a fait des essais
I'd say
dans
we
le
did
passé.
some
On a déjà
trials
fait
and
des
errors in the
bâtiments
past.
courts de
We did short
35
ones,
jours, on a déjà
35-day
fait
dry periods,
bâtiments longs.
and longer
Moi, je
dry
trouvais
cow
que
period
de cette
and longer
façon-là,
ones.
c'est
And we
vraiment
found that this way,
un entre-deux
it's in between, if you
qui
will,
permet d'avoir
allowing us to
un
have
peu plus de lait.
a bit
Donc,
more milk.
vu qu'on tarie à 45
So
jours, ça
as
nous
we do it
donne
at
un peu
45
d'une
days,
laine de
this
plus
gives
de
us
lait.
2
C'est sûr
weeks of
que
milk,
quand
additional milk, of
t'as plus
course.
de lait, ben,
When you have too
c'est
much
pas
milk,
idéal.
it's not ideal either, but
Mais
yeah.
dans une situation où tu as
But in
besoin
a
de lait, ça
situation
peut
where
être
you
très
need milk, it
intéressant
could be
de
really interesting
justement écourter
to
le
shorten
temps de tarissement pour
the dry period,
avoir un petit peu plus de
to
lait
have a bit more milk
pendant ces jours-là.
during those
Mais
days.
sinon,
Otherwise,
par le passé, on a déjà fait
in
des
the
bâtiments
past,
courts.
we did some
J'ai
short dry
pas eu
periods.
des bons résultats
I didn't
avec
have
ça,
great
moi,
results with that
personnellement.
personally, in my case.
Je dirais plutôt que
I'd
c'est
say
que tous les vaches qui veulent un petit
all
peu à l'avance,
the
ben
cows that are
ça leur
calving a
donne
bit
des très
early,
courtes
it
périodes
gives them a very short period
repos. Puis
to
ça
rest
impacte
and
directement la
recoup,
lactation
and this
prochaine. On avait des
impacted the
productions
next
plus
lactation.
basses.
We had
On
lower
avait
production
plus de
afterwards.
problèmes,
We
des
had
problématiques
more
après le
issues
vélage.
after calving.
Donc, pour nous,
So for
de cette
us,
façon-là, ça
this
fonctionne
way,
très bien.
it works really
Les
well.
premières lactations, ça
The
m'est
first
déjà arrivé
lactation, and this
pas
happened
les
before,
tarir,
not to
mettons,
dry
à
them, let's
60
say
jours.
at 60
Il y a
days.
une très grosse
And
impact
this
sur
has a big impact
la quantité de
on
lait,
the quantity
la
of milk
lactation en
and
deuxième
lactation
veau. Pour
with
nous,
the
ça a été
second
vraiment
calf. For
majeur.
us, this
On
was
a vu des
major.
différences de deuxième lactation
We saw a
qui
difference in
passent
second
de
lactation
10 000 à
going
12
from
000
10,000 to
kilos de lait
12,000
en
kilograms of milk
lactation,
through lactation
juste avec un tarissement un peu plus long.
with a longer dry
Donc,
period.
C'est super. Ben, puis je pense que tes
Well, that's
pratiques
great.
sont le parfait exemple.
And I think
justement,
this is the perfect example of the importance of having a dry up period long enough so cows can recoup. And this shows the impact that it can have on the next lactation, right? So now we'll move on to Trevor.
Switch to English now and go to Trevor to ask a few follow-up questions on that. So Trevor, first of all, Audrey, when she was sharing about her situation, shared about how they found themselves in an overstock situation. And when you can't change that immediately, what are some of the considerations, practices that people can focus on to reduce the impact that that has on cow behavior, comfort, and performance? And while you're on that topic, what may be other sources of stressor in that period? And how can we monitor those stressors? And when possible, how can we reduce them? So I know it's a loaded question. Let's go back to, if you're finding yourself in an overstock condition, what can you do to manage it?
Yeah, and can you hear me and see me? Sorry,
We're all good.
Okay.
I know on my end, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, yeah, I guess that is a loaded question. I'll try my best to answer that fairly succinctly. The question around crowding is a challenging one, and the challenge with stocking density, particularly with transition cows, close-up cows, fresh cows, particularly, is the fact that it's a stressor on cows, and that stressor not only has a physiological impact on the cows in terms of the stress itself causing potential changes leading to changes associated with the inflammation in the cows in terms of their immunological status and their ability to fight off infection. And then at the same time also has behavioral effects as well. And so we see cows that are stressed also in these situations, not devoting the time that they need to their various activities that they are required to perform, including consuming enough feed. And that can be a real challenge for dry cows. We know that particularly at close-up, those cows are at risk of decreasing in dry matter intake, and that can have various kind of domino effects in terms of the energy balance on the cow and her ability to make a good transition when she calves. And so alternatively, the cows that remain healthy tend to remain very steady in their dry matter intake in those days leading up to calving. And so if we can prevent stressors that are going to cause those drops in intake, that's going to be very, very important. And stocking density is one that we know has a very significant impact, particularly on these cows that are coming into in that close-up period and into lactation. And so, again, in situations where we're challenged with maybe more crowding than what we would hope, we need to then think about other ways of trying to mitigate some of those negative impacts, right? So recognizing that things like even just feed access is important. So making sure that there's feed available to those cows 24 hours a day. And I say that because there are many situations where we walk into barns and there might be bunks that are empty or the feed is just not pushed up. And in those situations, yeah, the cow may want to go to the bunk, and even if she does, there's no feed available to her, right? And so those situations, if we are in a crowded situation, we need to pay extra attention to making sure that that cow, when she does go to eat, she has every opportunity to do so. So there always needs to be feed there. It needs to be pushed up. And then the quality of it has a big role there too, right? And some of our challenges sometimes is just maintaining feed quality, making sure that, again, just like our lactating cows, we need to be feeding those dry cows every day. The risk with moving away from even once a day feeding on dry cows, which happens on some farms, is that feed quality deteriorates, particularly in the summertime, but even in the wintertime. And so our challenge there is maintaining that feed quality, not only through when we mix feed and deliver feed, but then also even from a bunk feed out standpoint, right? So maintaining good aerobic stability on our forages goes right back to the forages that we make, but then also the feed out procedure of those. And those things are very important from that. And then kind of tying into that is we want to minimize, and I guess that was part of the question, is we want to minimize other stressors then too, right? So if those cows are already in a time period where they're going to be susceptible to stressors, we want to make sure that other stressors that could potentially influence them are also minimized. And we think about things like heat stress mitigation, right? So a cow that is heat stressed, and we know we have episodic periods of heat stress in our Canadian summers from coast to coast. And that situation too can change the behavior of the cows, can result in them not consuming enough dry matter, and that can be accentuated then when you pile on top of other stressors on top of those animals. And so, again, making sure that just like we do for our lactating cows, we provide sufficient heat stress mitigation strategies for those dry cows. And then think about other stressors, and I think some of that was alluded to already by Audrey as well, in terms of making sure we think about when cows are moved, right, and how often they're moved around calving, and knowing that every time we do that, every time we move cows, we mix cows, that's a potential stressor. And so designing our facilities and management strategies to minimize some of those stressors on those cows is very important.
Lots of stressors to talk about, to think about. And speaking of, I think even just running a webinar online composes its own stressors for us. So I'm sure that Tyler certainly went through a stressful period right now, but we're happy to see him back online. So Tyler, if you just want to unmute yourself, and we'll go to you, continue the conversation there. And thank you for joining us again.
Yeah.
Awesome. So again, if we're just picking up from where we left off, Audrey shared some of her challenges, her situation on her farm. Could you share with us and more about your dry cow setup, how you manage your dry cows on your farm?
Sure. So we have a 2-group dry cow. We got 25 far-off stalls for the far-off cows, and then the rest of them are all in pack. We move cows once a week, and when we dry off a cow to reduce stress, we actually dry them down, go down to milking once a day, and put them in the far-off group from Monday to Thursday. When they're dried off, that on Mondays when we make our group change, only one group change a week. And we just found that drying them off, going to once a day, made a big difference in somatic cell and just stress on the cows. Everything that Trevor just talked about in kinds of terms of room, we challenge. We agree that room is a great thing, but we have to also learn to work within the facilities we have. So we find that we are in a bit of a crowded, or we are maxed. So to manage that, we have to be on top of everything. We have to have our forages where we want. We have to have the dry cow program 100%. And, we would love to build and give these cows more room, but we have to look at the economics at this time. So that's why we've gone through 2 or 3 dry cow programs, and we've gone to the negative DCAD, and that seems to work well. We tried other programs. We did Goldilocks for the first 10 years. I should probably tell you, when we took over, we were just kids. So 14 and 16-year-olds, so you learn a lot. We wanted to run one dry cow group and not feed the 2 groups different. We got away with that at a certain production level. But then once we hit a certain level, we had to do something different. So today we feed them a base ration, and then we go back and add the salts into our cows. But yeah, our challenges are always to make that transition 100%, because we have a very little of a hospital pen to deal with. So we have to have a smooth transition.
So touching on that, right? Because you know that you're overstocked more than you'd probably like to, everything else has to be 100%. So can you tell us a bit more about possible data that you may be looking at?
Sure.
Is there any technology that you use on your farm to make sure that your dry cows are doing properly so that you don't run into issues at calving?
Yeah, so I'd have to look at the year, but the best thing we did was we put in the SCR heat time system, and gives us rumination, and that's how we breed all our cows now. We don't have any weights in our parlor. It's a bare bone parlor, so we didn't even have that. The rumination is kind of key to managing our fresh cows. It catches cows before we'd ever see any physical signs. Plus, it allows us to make ration changes. If we change the ration and we see a huge drop in rumination, we'll go and see what's going on. So that's been a big plus for us.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So thank you for sharing that, Tyler. And we're now going to go to Trevor to ask him a few more questions, specifically regarding dry cow programs. So Trevor, what are, when we're looking at different dry cow programs or diets, what are the main 2 things that we're trying to achieve? And what are different strategies that we can use to achieve this, staying high level without going into the nitty-gritty that I'm sure all farmers on this call can work through with their nutritionists?
Yeah, I guess maybe there's more than 2. We'll see. Can you hear me? Sorry,
yeah, we can. It's it was just a little spotty, but you're good now. Yeah, so maybe not just 2, but
so
key points.
I think kind of following up on where I was going in my previous answer, talking about stressors. One of the biggest challenges that we have with dry cows and is just maintenance of dry matter intake, and that goes for any cow. And so particularly with our close-up cows, the maintenance of dry matter intake, and I also throw in there maintenance of water consumption, also very important. And I'll throw in a little plug there that, like, water access, having good quality water and lots of water space, multiple watering spots per pen, very important for dry cows just as much as lactating cows, because we know that, again, water is not only a super important nutrient for keeping the body working, but also even for helping drive dry matter intake, right? So the more cows eat, the more they need to drink, and the more they drink, the more they can eat. So we really have to focus on that in those dry cows as well. The intake of the cows also, like I said, very super important from a number of perspectives. One is just from that energy balance standpoint. We want to make sure that that cow keeps her intake up so that when she gets on her lactating diet, she can make a nice smooth transition, keep that rumen full and keep it working. And that's also one of the reasons why we want that cow to keep her intake high in that prepartum period, because that's not only gonna, again, maintain energy consumption and nutrient consumption for that cow as she's starting to get ready to calve. It's also good for the calf who's still developing inside of her. But then the rumen itself, in terms of keeping the size of that rumen working well, the muscles working well, keeping the bacteria as well as even the rumen papillae that are going to undergo kind of a stress in themselves as that cow transitions to lactation and she starts consuming a diet that, again, not only in a larger amount, but also that's going to result in a lot more acid production. She's got to be ready to absorb that acid to, again, not fall into a situation where she's going to get acidosis. And then also, yeah, deal with the energy from that. And so, for all those reasons, having a strong intake in those cows is very important. The flip side of that is we want that cow to do that throughout the dry period, and even in the close-up period, well, meeting her requirements, but not necessarily over consuming nutrients to the point that she, well, on one side wastes them, but on the other side starts putting that energy, maybe excess energy, into body fat. And we know that another big challenge that we have with dry cows is having cows calve in at a optimal body condition score. And the data would tell us that cows that are over conditioned, and it used to be on a scale of 1 to 5, we used to think of these cows that were 4s and 5s being over conditioned. Now we're thinking that anything kind of at a 3.5 and higher is a cow that's over conditioned. And the challenge with those cows is that those cows not only have lesser dry matter intake during the dry period, but that carries through into early lactation. And those cows tend to have the worst transitions. They tend to go into the greatest negative energy balance. They tend to lose the most weight. And so the relative amount of weight loss on those cows is higher than a cow that kind of comes into transition and calving at a more optimal body condition. And so that, again, that can be influenced by a whole bunch of factors, including how we feed those cows in that close-up period. And so, again, designing diets that are going to, again, not only maximize intake in cows, but control also the amount of energy that those cows are consuming so that they don't become over conditioned. And then there's other things that we need to think about specifically within there as well. And Tyler mentioned too, kind of management of hypocalcemia, both clinical milk fever, but also subclinical hypocalcemia, also very important in these animals. So having a strategy to do that, right? So whether that's through creating a metabolic acidosis through a negative DCAD type diet, whether we use some kind of binder product, or we go to a more traditional kind of approach of trying to just manage those diets through kind of the mineral contents, watching our calcium content, watching our potassium content of those diets. But in any of those cases, we need to, again, let the cows tell us, right, how they're responding to those things, and be willing and able to make adjustments based on what we see our cows doing in those scenarios.
Awesome. That was a lot of information. So thank you. And I hope everyone's taking notes. And the goal of this conversation is not just to have me ask you questions. So I'd now like to pass it over to Tyler. I think, Tyler, you have a question for Trevor at this point.
Yeah. I'm still running a little behind here.
All good. Do you want me to give you a hand?
Sure, that'd be great.
Excellent. So Tyler's question, because we met before today to just make sure that we made sure that Tyler and Audrey's questions for Trevor were ready and were addressed. And so the question that Tyler had for Trevor is different considerations that we have to keep in mind, or what are they when we're adjusting feed programs beside the nutrition, right? How do different characteristics, even just of the feed itself, affect cow health, behavior? So hopefully that summarizes your question and that helps us move forward on. Essentially, I think one of the comments that you had is the ration that's on paper doesn't necessarily match the ration that gets fed to the cows and the ration that the cow consumes. And so I think Trevor has a lot to share on that. So Trevor, maybe just briefly giving people kind of a recap of what that means.
Yeah, and I guess again, I'll try to be brief. My most brief statement or answer to this is we know cows really like consistency. They love consistency in terms of their behavior, in terms of their routines. We see that when it comes to handling cows. We see that when it comes to milking cows. Our research and that of others would also suggest that that's also when it comes to feeding of cows and the diet the cows receive and the diet they consume. And the challenge, as you just alluded to, is that yeah, we often talk about the fact that there may be different diets in terms of right, you've got a diet on paper, you've got a diet that's fed, then there's the diet that's actually consumed by the cows, and our challenge is trying to make those things match, right? And obviously if we work kind of backwards, we want the diet fed to be consumed by the cows, and so limiting sorting of cows very important in the dry period too, especially with even far off diet, but particularly close-up diets, again, when we're thinking about consistency and intake, watching our forage particle sizes, especially if we're employing some of these other programs like a DCAD program or a binder program with our in terms of our hypocalcemia management. Those are additives that we add in relatively small amounts relative to the diet, and we need those consumed at a certain level to ensure their effectiveness. And we want to ensure that consistency across cows. And again, if cows are sorting their diets because the forage particles are too long and the diets may be too dry or something like that, then we're going to end up with more inconsistency. And so you're going to end up seeing more inconsistent results across your dry cows. And so that's a big challenge there. We also see differences in terms of like when people deviate too much from what they're kind of designed to feed, so to speak, from a nutritionist ration formulation standpoint. And we have some recent data that would suggest that as farms deviate from kind of their targeted nutrient values in their diet, particularly their close-up diets, we see greater negative kind of health outcomes in their transition cows. And sometimes those things are direct cause and effects. Other cases, it's more symptomatic, right? So a farm that maybe is more variable in terms of the diet fed relative to what their nutritionist is saying should be fed, they also may be more variable in other aspects of their management. And all that variability kind of adds up and results in some of the challenges that we see, as opposed to those farms that are very consistent across the way that they manage things. And that consistency can really pay off. And again, that's when we do have situations where the diet being fed doesn't match what the nutritionist has put down on paper. I always urge producers to go back and have those conversations to think about, okay, what are we trying to achieve, and why is that the case, and why some of those deviations might be occurring. Because at the end of the day, too, we have very good information. We have good science. We have good information about feeds, and we know what those cows should be receiving, so to speak, from a nutrient standpoint to optimize the health and production of those cows. And so we want our producers to take advantage of that information as much as possible.
Awesome. So that's a lot of great information to make sure that cows are ready for calving, essentially. Je vais maintenant passer en français
I'm
juste
going to
pour
move
un
to French
instant
now, just
pour
for a
m'assurer
moment,
qu'Audrey
to
est aussi
ensure
disponible
that
sur la
Audrey
ligne,
is
car
still
qu'Audrey
here
avait
on
une
the line
question
because
aussi à poser
Audrey
à
also
Trevor.
had a
Donc,
question
Audrey
for
va poser sa
Trevor.
question à
So
Trevor pour
Audrey will
Trevor va
ask
y
her
répondre en
question
anglais.
to Trevor, and Trevor will respond in English. Audrey, over to you. Thank you very much. So my question is the following. So what were the recommendations in terms of the dry cow for dry off, basically? So we have a number of programs, right? There are a few producers doing different things, like, for example, like what Tyler was saying, you know, they stop milking the cow or they milk the cow once a day. And then after that, you know, they become a dry cow. So what's the recommendation, the ideal recommendation for drying off a cow?
I'm just going to jump in back in English until Trevor's translation kicks in and to help translate Audrey's question. So essentially around what are best practices around dry off?
Yeah. Yeah, I got that. Can you hear me?
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, great question. And maybe I'll preface my answer by saying that proper dry off is becoming more and more of a question and concern in the dairy industry for a number of reasons. Number one is, and we've known this for a long time, is that, yeah, cows that maybe dry off, not only with maybe infections, right? Like subclinical mastitis infections. Obviously, that's problematic, and that's why we've implemented different dry off strategies to try and minimize those risks or to cure infections that those cows might be facing. We also know that cows that dry off maybe at high production levels, those cows may be at higher risk of incurring infections not only in the early post kind of dry off period, but that risk might actually carry right through the dry period into the next lactation. In addition to that, cows that dry off with higher levels of milk production, we also see a fair amount of inflammation in those cows at that time period, particularly post dry off. And not only is that inflammation something physical that the cow feels, and we see evidence of udder engorgement and pain in those cows, and so that can be a difficult period of time from a welfare perspective on those cows. But even that inflammation, which may be physiological in those cows, there's more and more data to suggest that that inflammation may not only occur there, but may persist throughout the entire dry period, right to that point of the next lactation on the cows. And as I alluded to earlier, one of the challenges that we have with early lactation cows is excessive inflammation. Now, obviously, a cow that calves is going to have some level of inflammation. Having too much of that, though, has really proven in the last number of years in research as being a problem for dairy cows. And so we're challenged with trying to do a better job with minimizing risk for that. And dry off is a great example of that, where we have an opportunity there. If cows are at low levels of milk production, 20 kilos or less, for example, of milk production at the point we want to dry them off, not so much of a risk. However, if we have cows that are milking at 30, 35 kilos, or I've even seen higher than that, at the point where those cows need to be dried off, those are real risk factors. And so we need to implement strategies to reduce that milk production prior to the point of dry off. And probably do so over a 2 to 3 week period of time. The opportunities are going to vary from farm to farm, right? So if we were milking with robots, I think we have one of the best opportunities, and we've done some research on this to suggest that, yeah, we can adjust milking settings in the robot where we can bring the allowable milkings down on those cows so that they're only getting milked one and a half times a day on average, for example, in that final week prior to dry off. We can reduce some of the incentive to get there and have so many frequent milkings too, by also reducing the amount of feed that we provide in the robot. So there's a great opportunity there. If we're milking in tie barns, again, we can implement lower milking frequencies very easily on cows. And in those situations where it becomes more challenging is when we've got parlor milking barns, where that would require either separating cows out into a separate group where they might only get milk, say, once a day for the last week or something like that before calving, or creating a separate pen of cows to do that. And so that's going to vary from farm to farm in terms of what they're capable of in terms of management. It was also in terms of housing those cows, because in an ideal world too, we'd also then start to bring the nutrient consumption of those cows down prior to dry off as well. And some manage that simply by putting those cows onto a far off dry cow diet, and that can work as well, or just to some kind of all forage diet where, again, we're allowing those cows to eat. Again, we're allowing them to drink as much as they want water. And it's very important for those cows as well. But we're limiting the total amount of nutrients the cow consumes, and that's going to really help drive that production down and try get those cows down at least, again, those cows that are producing 30-35 liters, try to get them down 5 to 10 liters of milk production before the point of dry off in those cows.
Thanks so much, Trevor, for that very thorough answer. I think that highlights how many possible ways there are of doing things around the dry off. And ultimately, the objective is that we know what we're doing, that we stick to it, and that we focus on the small details. So I'm going to move over to Tyler and Audrey next. Mais avant, je vais passer en français.
But before that, I'm going to move over to French. So I'll just give you just a short moment. I'll allow the translators to catch up. And we would like to invite you now. We're going to do a second survey. And so just for our panelists, just leave, I'll let the answers stream on in for a short moment. We've got a couple of questions here for you, for our participants. Danik, if you want to put that on the screen, that would be great, or start the survey. So first of all, how are your dry cows grouped? First question. Second question, what do you do to assess your dry cow program? I know that there are rumination techniques. Do you have other ways of measuring progress and the success of your transition program? And finally, what are the improvements that you have made or that you would like to put in place for your dry cows? So we're asking you all these questions because the next questions with Audrey and Tyler will be focused on success and solutions that they have found on their farm. They'll talk about what they're proud of, and if they were to redo the work, what things would change. So we do see that there are a couple of responses coming in, and that will really help when we get to the conclusion. And it'll allow Trevor, Tyler, and Audrey to have a better idea of, who's done what are the challenges, the motivations. We hope that what Tyler and Audrey have already done will inspire you as well. So we do see that there are a lot of people in our group who are separating the dry cows and calving cows. For people with cows in the same group, how do you manage that? And let's see here. We see a nice separation of people using all sorts of data to assess their program. So that's really good. So we've got, 37 responses. That's really great. Thank you to all of you who took the time to answer our questions. It's always very helpful. If ever we get the chance to meet in person and talk about what we've learned, that would be really great as well. Anyway, we've got about a few minutes left together, so I will turn the floor over to Audrey. Audrey, my question for you is twofold. First of all, what are the changes that you made to your farm that you're the most proud of when it comes to your dry-off program? Oh, I might sort of share a couple of images here that might sort of reveal your answer. But if you had to if you had to redo something, what would you do? So perhaps in 2-3 minutes you could share those answers. Yes, thank you. So basically, in 2024, we added a robot. So we're fully robotic now. So that was in 2024. We had one milking parlor and one robot since 2019. So we managed things in 2 ways. And I think that what's a little unusual, I would say, a little unusual in most dairy production is that for dairy production is that rather than attempting to make room for the animals, we decreased our dairy herd a little bit so that we had more room for our dry cows and our cows approaching calving. So we had 200 cows, and we freed up an entire group to house our dry cows. And then for the milking parlor, we renovated to get some calving parks, calving stalls. And in 2024, we increased the amount of milk by about 2 kilos per cow. I am guessing that in 2025, we will go up again by 2 kilos. For now, that's what's going on.
C'est sûr que aussi, en ayant plus les vaches dans un dôme à l'extérieur,
if we don't have cows outside under a dome, then the cows in calving needed to be brought into the building. And so there were a lot of changes, a lot of movement, a lot of stress on the cows during dry off and calving. Like there was a lot of stress on our cows, and at times when we didn't want stress on the cows. And so the change that we made will be a big advantage to the herd. And we're already seeing the positive results, actually. We, in terms of management, we see less cow movement.
Qui est beaucoup relié dans le fond au stress.
And it's the movement that's connected to the stress, right? There are lots of challenges there. Great, thank you. Those are big changes. And it's amazing how much you've innovated and that you used what was already there to improve your way of doing things. I think those are great examples. We don't have to build from scratch to succeed our goals. So it's really good. I'm going to move to English now.
Tyler, asking you a very similar question. So what is, a main change that you've made or a change in your approach in the last few years that has had a big impact, and the changes that or the results that you've observed as a result of that? I know that we're all passionate about the transition period and the dry period on this call. So we'll try and keep it to 5 minutes or so that we can keep the last 15 minutes for question and answer. But go ahead, Tyler. We have a few pictures as well here on our slides to help people, for lack of being able to visit you in person in P.E.I, to just get an insight into your farm.
Sure. So the biggest thing we've done over the years that we learned from our mistakes, you start with a program, you think it's going good, and then as your production goals change, you have to adapt your dry cows. We've gone to the DCAD, so that's how we found a real big reduction in everything, all our transition issues. If we do have a 5th or 6th lactation cow that does get milk fever, it's a very quick treatment and she's up. So that was one big end. That's why we're at DCAD. As you'll see in our barn, milk cows on one side of the barn, dry cows on the other. That's also been kind of by luck, but we get to see the dry cows all the time. Back to the DCAD, it was 2 mixes. That was when we really started to see the change. And now we talked about dry matter intake, and that's one thing we monitor really closely. But the key to these programs is to make sure that they eat all their intake, all that's put out for them, especially in the DCAD. So if you feed for refusals, you will have problems. We have to make sure that they consume everything that's out in the close-up group. If we do that, we have very few issues. If we feed for 5% refusals, we have issues. We also use the rumination collars like we spoke about before. And every cow, we measure their bricks, test the colostrum and test the bricks. We record the first 3 milkings, the milk weights of every first 3 milkings for each cow. And we've increased the energy in our dry cow ration to be closer to our dairy ration so that it's not as big of a change. That's some of the things we've done. And just on a personal note, sometimes we get caught up on all this nutrition talk and all these programs, and we kind of get lost and overcomplicate it. And we brought it back to just simple dry matter intake and just little tweaks and working with our nutritionist and and our data. It made quite a difference. So I don't think things have to be complicated. The cows just have to get the correct ration. Use your facilities. Space is always great to have, and more space is even better. But don't be afraid to make changes in your own barn and challenge yourself and challenge your nutritionist. We had a period of time where we were at 250 kgs, and was told that that was all our barn could produce. And now we've proved that it can produce double that in the same facility. So look at your goals. Our goals now are fat and protein, and we have a fat of over 5 all year. And that's what we, just have goals, and then you have to reevaluate your goals over time. And don't be afraid to learn from your mistakes. That's pretty much it.
Thanks so much, Tyler, and thanks for sharing kind of the involvement in your thought pattern to hopefully inspire other farmers on the call. We only have 15 minutes left together, so we have a lot more questions that we had for Tyler, for Trevor, for Audrey, but we're going to skip right to our question and answer period. So je vais passer en français pour notre traduction.
I'll move on to French here for the translation. So for those of you who may not already done it, if you have questions, we invite you to share them in the chat box for Tyler, Trevor, and Audrey, so that we can spend the last 15 minutes together. I'm going to go back now and start with a question.
Or for Trevor, because it is an audience question that we got as Tyler was talking about his dry cow program, and that is briefly, what is a decad ration, or what is an anionic, what are anionic salts? And just briefly, because I think it's important for our audience to just understand what Tyler does in his program and at his farm.
Oh, sorry. So yeah, the question is just around that. And so the idea behind an anionic diet is that we basically, the goal at the end of the day is to create a metabolic acidosis in cows, where by what that does in a dry cow as she approaches calving, is that actually helps with calcium mobilization from the bone, so that at the point of calving, when that surge in calcium is needed by that cow, and we know that she can't necessarily get all of that from her feed intake, that she's going to be ready to be able to mobilize that calcium also from her own physical structure, from her bones. And so the anionic diets help that. We can create a little bit of an anionic, so more a negative decad diet, by through kind of formulation in terms of minimizing positive cations in the diet. So again, we think about calcium and potassium being positive and having a higher proportion of chloride and sulfur, for example. Typically, we do that through different supplements that are available. So we talk about anionic supplements, and there's a variety of them on the market, typically including various forms of chloride to be able to increase that negative anion concentration within the diet.
Excellent. I know that a lot of people in the chat had questions about that, so thank you so much.
And maybe I can...
Oh, go ahead, Trevor.
I'll just add one thing. That the
Absolutely.
one thing with that one is we do need to just also ensure and that cows are properly acidified. And so one of the management things associated with that is checking the urine pHs of cows periodically on farm, to ensure that we're kind of in the correct zone, so to speak, as far as the level of acidification that we have on those cows. So.
Absolutely. I think that could be a topic for a webinar on its own. I know I continue learning lots about it. There is someone in the chat who's asking if there's specific people that, you would recommend going to if they have more questions on that topic. So again, whether it be right now in the chat or afterwards in the follow-up email, just want to point that out and make sure that that question is noticed. But another important question that came in the chat is again for you, Trevor. So there's a lot of limitations sometimes around managing cows as a single group. So what are possible considerations when when you do have just a single group and you have to make sure that the dietary needs of both your far off dry cows as well as your close up cows are met? And something that we didn't touch on either, and again, there's a lot of it's a loaded question, but also just what's the difference between dietary needs of our multiparous versus primiparous cows? Someone asked in the chat, even just how do you manage those heifers that are in their close-up? So we may not have time to address all of these questions today, and I do know that we can direct people afterwards to the right resources if we run out of time, but even just getting people started on those answers would be fantastic.
Yeah, and I guess at the end of the day, we recognize that there are slight differences in terms of nutrient requirements between our pre-fresh heifers, our first lactation animals versus our older animals. Those older animals, again, for example, benefit from more kind of calcium management strategies, as opposed to those first lactation cows where it's not as important. Whereas those animals, they're also growing. And so they have different kind of energy, protein, other nutrient kind of requirements, a little bit different. Our challenge is that just from a management standpoint, based on farm size, based on groupings, to actually make separate rations and have kind of large enough groups of those animals to sustain separate rations where we can make good mixes, right? And sometimes it comes back to even just the size of our mixer wagons and making sure we have a consistent mix that we can make like I said earlier, a delivery every day for those cows. We're constrained, and so we end up having to make a single diet. And again, we live kind of within those constraints. Always encourage producers to work with their nutritionists in terms of what is optimal. Going back to the earlier part of the question related to, challenges with that one group feeding, and that's really the fact that, like, not only between, say, first lactation animals and older animals, we have differences, but then also between far off and close-up animals, there are challenges. And definitely there's, if we have facility space, we have the feeding opportunity to make separate mixes for far off and close-up cows. I recommend that. And that way we can also then use kind of different strategies for managing energy and nutrient consumption in those close-up animals, as well as our calcium management strategies. But when we don't have that opportunity, and in some farms that are smaller, particularly, we may be better off to manage them as one group. And in those cases, kind of the same principles apply. We just need to make sure that we're, again, promoting intake across all cows. We're getting the required nutrients. We're not overfeeding those cows necessarily in terms of their nutrients so that they become overconditioned. We also have to be careful in that case of dry period length, right? So we don't want, especially if it's a one group, we don't need excessively long dry periods on cows. And some of that goes back to reproductive management of those cows in the previous lactation, and then also timing of dry off and all these kind of things in order to ensure again that those cows are on those diets for kind of a proper amount of time.
Excellent. I know that there was a lot of questions coming in, but I'm now going to shift it to Audrey. Donc, pour nos traducteurs, je vais changer en français.
Let's switch to French now. Audrey, one question that we had for you also. There's other people on the call that want to do renovation. What are the key considerations, what you kept in mind when you renovated your farm, or things that you learned and you'd like to share as advice to our fellow producers and counselors that are joining us on today's webinar? Well, of course, for us, I'd say it wasn't a new facility. We already had limits. The space was already limited. We had challenges when it came to where we could put the robot compared to the various distances and gaps that we wanted. Of course, I think what we did really well and what was missing, well, we did well, except what's missing is where they can eat and the space for the feeder. It's sufficient, but it's not sufficient when it's overcrowded, right? When you have too many animals, then the feeder is not sufficient. So a bit like Trevor was saying, well, then there's some repercussion. This has an impact on animal consumption. So for now, our main challenge is when we prepare for calving, we renovated our milking area, and this was fine. Nonetheless, we prepared the site in a good way for calving, but there's just not enough room. We need twice as much space as what we have right now to really have enough space for our animals. Right. I think you have to take that into consideration. There's never enough space, right? Well, thank you very much, Audrey.
I'm going to switch back to English for just one last question, or even just leaving Tyler an opportunity to share any last thoughts on that, anything that we touched about, or question or recommendations that you have for any farmers who may be on the call. I know we talked about a lot about managing the dry cow program in terms of nutrition, just how you're doing things on your farm. Any parting words that you want to share with our audience before we move on and wrap up?
Sure. It's just, we all talked about it. I think dry matter intake and just watching your cows. Do you know what I mean? Little tweaks here and there, change one thing at a time. And when something's not working, don't be afraid to look at another program. And sometimes, I know in our case, we as a producer make the mistake, right? Like we fed for refusals when we fed another program and it didn't work. So that was probably our mistake, not the product. So don't be afraid to ask new people for help, try new things, and just talk to other producers. Usually they've experienced what you have, and you'll learn something, and it'll benefit you and your farm. So that's all for me. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tyler. So that brings us to the end of today's webinar. And I just want to say thank you to our three panelists for joining us today. I do invite you, if you're still here, to thank them in the chat, or you can use the React function as well. Before you leave for today and go on with all of these ideas and recommendations, we would appreciate if you take 2 minutes, take your phone, scan the QR code that's on the screen, and help us improve on our future webinars. Fill out the satisfaction form. We'll also be sending that out with the webinar notes and recording or materials. And I just want to remind everyone that it is absolutely possible to design a dry cow program and housing that suits the needs of your farm. Today was just an example of how many considerations there are to help you get thinking about that. I know that you're all well surrounded with your own experts, counselors, advisors, whether it be vets, nutritionists, agronomists. Remember to keep your cows comfortable, hopefully minimize complications as a result. And again, I want to thank you for joining us today, and make sure that we reduce the stressors not only on our cows, but on ourselves as well. Just a last note as well on the Canadian Dairy Hub to remind you that we are continuously developing new content for you. So I will leave this slide up as well if you're interested in learning more. We do have our webpage that is continually evolving, so you can visit that. You can also join our mailing list. So we're working hard to give you direct new updates, new information directly to your inbox, and ultimately you can follow us on social media. So thanks again for being with us today. If you have any additional questions that come up, whether it be for Trevor, Tyler, for Audrey, feel free to email us as well at ktt.ca or at ktt@lactanet.ca. We'll make sure to pass those on as well. And with that, thank you so much and have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much. Bye for now.